Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming to this year's Economic Outlook Seminar put forth by the University of Montana's Bureau of Business and Economic Research. My name's Ian Marquand. I'm going to be your MC and moderator today. And right now it's my extreme pleasure to be able to introduce to you the Provost of the University of Montana, Perry Brown.
Thanks, Ian. On behalf of President Engstrom and all of the faculty, staff, and students at the University of Montana, and especially the staff of the Bureau of Economic and Business Research, let me welcome you to this Outlook Seminar. I've been coming to the Outlook seminars myself for the last 17 years, I think. I missed one maybe in that whole period of time. I find these a fascinating and important part of my education and an opportunity to get a sense for where things are going within the state and within the region, and I hope you will have that same pleasure today. Let me just take a moment and tell you about a couple of things about the university right now, because it's a big part of the economy of the state of Montana, as you well know. We prepare those people that work in the jobs that many of you provide within the state, and we prepare people that create new companies and are engaged in employment in the state. We also have a huge research operation that brings millions of dollars to Missoula particularly, but is spread throughout the state. Lots of people employed in that. It's an economic engine in its own right. We have about a half a dozen initiatives that President Engstrom has put forward of things that we're working on. I'll just quickly mention those. At the top of our list is what we call student success. We are really pushing hard right now to make sure that we graduate more Montanans for jobs in Montana, we hope. But certainly we graduate more Montanans and prepare them for a great and a wonderful life as they go forward with an education that helps them provide the kind of opportunities that they are looking for. We are focused very much on all levels of education, so we have initiatives dealing with two-year education, preparing the immediate workforce, and opening opportunities for people to come into the university. We certainly have an undergraduate education program that is robust, lots of people engaged in it, and here we're producing, we hope, leaders for the future, workforce, and citizens that will really be engaged in the development of our state. We certainly have a graduate program, and that's growing as well, and part of the graduate program is focused on really growing those people that are going to be entrepreneurs and opening new businesses and bringing new technologies and new ideas and working in science also within the state of Montana. Our research program, as I already mentioned, is fairly robust right now. We have a lot of things going on in that particular area. It's a real economic driver, and we are in the process of developing new technologies, new ideas, delivering new things to the marketplace and to people that really need to know what's happening. And then finally, we are trying to build a really world-class learning environment so that our students, our staff, our faculty, our administrators are all learning together in a place that they say, this is the best opportunity provided in the United States for learning. And so we're working to do that. And if we're successful in moving on all of these initiatives and moving the things that we have in mind in terms of specifics, we are going to be successful. Montana's going to be successful. And because we're located in Missoula, Missoula will be really successful, I think, with the help that we have. Three things that we need, I'm just going to mention, going to be very helpful. As you all know, it's a legislative session. We clearly need a good base budget so that we have a place to go to, so we make sure that things are affordable for students. We don't want to keep increasing the price on students if the state can help us out, and so that's an important item. Second is we need a competitive workforce. We always need that. You need a competitive workforce as well. We do too. So we need to be able to take care of the people that we have. We need a compensation package and other things. And finally, a big element for Missoula, you probably already know, the College of Technology facilities were built for 700 students. This spring, we will have a record approximately 2,500 students enrolled at the College of Technology. If you would like to see another 1,000 people in this room and feel how it is every day at the College of Technology, we could probably go on the streets and bring them in at a little time, or we could go to Cairo and get a few of them that are demonstrating right now or something like that. But you would know what it feels like over there. We need help. We need a lot of help in getting that facility. So I just make that rather blatant plea to everybody. Anyway, on behalf of all of us, we're glad you're here. Welcome to the Outlook Seminar. I think this is a great opportunity for us all to learn what's going on, and Pat Barkey and his crew have got a wonderful program put together for us. So thanks very much and welcome.
Thank you, Perry. The Bureau of Business and Economic Research was founded in 1948. That's the year that Truman beat Dewey. It's the last time the Cleveland Indians won the World Series. So that's been quite a while. And over the last 63 years, the Bureau has expanded from 4 employees to 30 full or part-time employees. And each year, as you know, the Bureau staffers travel around the state. During the year, they field thousands of requests for information and expertise, but each year they also travel around the state and come to you to prepare a status report on Montana's economy in a national, state, and local context, and now even really a global context. Today, that tradition continues for the 36th time. And think about that, 36 times ago, no laptop computers, no PowerPoint projectors. Everything was a little bit more difficult. In fact, Paul Polzin told me when they made charts way back in the first one of these in the 70s, they actually had to hire an artist to create the charts, and then they were photographed and they were shown by a slide projector. And those charts were made by a young artist named Monty Dolak. How about that? I do have some housekeeping things. For one thing, this is the largest audience that we have on this tour, and so it's a very large room. So when the time comes for questions, we have 2 mic stands in the center of the room, and we would ask that if you have a question, please come to the mic stand, even if you have to line up. Just pretend it's a legislative hearing. Line up and you can ask your question. Also, now this is a little bit like the reading of the rules for the Academy Awards, but and I'm not going to sing them like some people have tried. We do offer a lot of continuing education credits through the Bureau for attending here, so I need to let you know who offers continuing education credit for attending. The Montana Society of Certified Public Accountants, the Institute of Certified Management Accountants, the Society of American Foresters, Montana's Education Teacher Professional Renewal Units Program, the Montana Board of Real Estate Appraisers, Montana's Board of Realty Regulation, the Montana Insurance Continuing Education Program, the Montana Board of Social Work Examiners and Professional Counselors, and the Montana Board of Nursing Home Administrators. So all of those have approved, all those organizations have approved continuing ed credit. For those of you that are attending and that want to get that credit, thank you for being here. You should get your certificates in about 4 to 6 weeks, and if you don't, please call the Bureau. Just want to call your attention to a couple other things in your packets. You do have the Outlook 2011 book, and in the back of that is an evaluation form. This is really important for the Bureau folks so they know if they're giving you what you want and what you need. So please fill these out, and there will be boxes out in the foyer for you to drop the completed surveys. So look at the material that's in there, pay attention to it, it's got some very good information. However, you're not going to see all the PowerPoint slides in that book because it would probably be that thick if you did. So you can go to the website of the Bureau, and that's on the inside front cover at the Bureau's logo has got the website, and you can see all these PowerPoint slides that will tell you the dramatic stories today. So with that, let me introduce Pat Barkey, the Director of the Bureau of Business and Economic Research, who will talk today in our keynote presentation about paying for the recession. Pat?
Thanks, Ian. I'll clap for myself. Thanks. We're going to start this morning a little bit differently. I'll be talking about the outlook in a few minutes. But in coming up with an idea for this program this year, we realized that there's a lot of us who are really concerned about the aftermath of the recession we've just been through. In fact, this recession has been, as I mentioned last year, the longest and deepest recession since World War II. If you look at the time path of a typical recession, there's a long list of them on this graph. All recessions have one thing in common. The economy goes into reverse. That's the downturn. The recovery is when it heads up. This is the profile of a recession back in 1948. Funny you would mention that year. All recessions have different trajectories. We've tracked them all for years. Many economists have made a career doing that, including ourselves. The question is, where is this recession? And this recession, as you can see, has been longer and deeper. We're just getting back to where we were before. It's still on the same page. But the interesting thing about this recession is, and I don't know if this is very well known, that we have now, as we sit here almost to the beginning of February 2011, we've been out of the recession longer than we were in it. So it's appropriate to talk about what kind of recovery we have. So let's fix that, Bob. Let's talk about the recovery. And in fact, what we're hoping to see happen, and which is not really happening yet, is the economy come back into a kind of balance. We know a lot about what's happening with government deficits because that's really front and center in terms of what's been happening. But there's a number of things happening in the economy over the last decade that give us this feeling that we're out of balance, that things are not working, things are not operating smoothly. And economic balance is really something we really never really get to. The economy is never truly balanced. But we're working towards balance, and the economy is balancing lots of things. We worry about balancing consumption and production in the economy. When we try to consume more than we produce, we have things like inflation, and those aren't good. We worry about it. We worry about the balance between saving and investment, because setting money aside and not consuming everything we make is what gives businesses a pool of funds that they can use to invest for the future and make our standards of living better as we go forward. We worry about, economists go to sleep uttering the mantra, supply and demand. I mean, it truly is all about supply and demand. And of course, supply and demand, when they're out of balance, that's when we have prices changing. And prices change in the economy all the time. So the economy is always in the process of coming to balance, not necessarily in balance. And of course, in our country, we worry a great deal, as we should, about the balance between imports and exports. And that's yet another sign that the U.S. economy is maybe not really working correctly, because we know we've been importing a lot more than we've exported for quite a few years now. And so what can we say about this recession and the kinds of things that have happened in the last 10 years? Where do we stand? And as I look out at the economy, and many of you do as well, I see some things that really cause some concern. I mean, we've had kind of a real roller coaster decade with housing. So we've had this sense that something's out of balance with housing. I mean, we had this enormous demand, enormous price increases in housing, flip this house on TV, all kinds of phenomena associated with the housing price boom. And that's really a symptom of something in the economy that we know got out of whack. Another thing we worry a lot about in the economy, and this is a longer term perspective, is how much Americans are saving. I talked about how we need a pool of funds that businesses can invest, and those come from saving. If not our saving, then somebody else's saving. And in the last decade or so, it's been somebody else's saving, not ours. That's really an imbalance that doesn't seem like it can go on. Speaking of someone else, you look at global trade imbalances. We look at countries which are consistently running surpluses and deficits. It's an imbalance, and of course, we're worried about government deficits. I want to kind of talk about some of these areas and talk about what the recession has done to these imbalances, because as the not so famous economist Herbert Stein said, he's not a comedian, he actually was an economist, and he said that things that can't go on forever usually don't. And that's exactly what happened in housing. And in fact, that's exactly what's happening in every single one of these trends. Because government deficits can't go on forever. They have, but they can't go on forever. And so the question is, what do we do to right these balances? And how can we fix these problems? And what's being done? And in fact, the recession has already done some of the fixing for us. The housing price boom is really largely corrected. I say largely because we're not exactly back to where we were before, but we're getting pretty doggone close. Housing boom has turned into, as you know, a housing bust. And that's not been a fun thing to live through, but at least we're back to a point where we can start to see a little bit more normality in that market. Low savings and high borrowing. Americans are saving more. I'll show you that in a second. Global trade imbalances, we have a problem, and with respect to deficits, that font actually didn't get bigger, but they are red letters, getting worse. It is a big problem. Let me talk about a little bit about what's happened in these parts of the economy and what's happened to bring us back into balance in terms of economic growth. In terms of housing, I think the housing boom has not really been well understood by many. Many people think the housing boom was a construction boom. My God, we're throwing up houses like crazy, and now we have this huge inventory of unsold houses to work off. There's some truth to that, but really if you look at the fundamentals, if you look at how many houses we're building versus what? Well, I chose the number of new households formed in the U.S. Of course, that's related to population growth, but households by definition are a group of people who live in one housing unit. And if you look, for example, as I do on this graph in the 1960s, and on the horizontal axis is the growth in households. How many new households were created net in the U.S. over the 1960s? It's about 11 million. And we built about 14 million new housing units in that same decade. And in fact, if you look at the other decades leading up to 2000, you get this relationship which is really pretty regular. And you can see that, yes, during some decades there's been more households. That's, of course, the demographics. That's the baby boomers coming of age, forming households. And in that decade, we built more. Other decades, we brought less. But it's a pretty regular relationship. And in fact, if you look at the first 8 years of this decade, it's really right on track. We really didn't go that crazy building houses in the 2000s. What it was instead was a housing price boom. And of course, housing prices are always going up, but in the last decade, they went up much faster than income. So if you look at the ratio of housing prices to income, something very remarkable happened. First off, how do we measure housing prices? Lots of different ways. This particular way is done with a housing index put out by the Federal Home Finance Agency, and it shows this ratio. And you can see all throughout the 90s, really nothing happening. So housing prices and income going up right about the same rate. And then, of course, we had this tremendous appreciation. And that ratio went up by 40% by this measure. By a narrower measure, which is a different measure of housing prices, the Case-Shiller Index, which measures urban areas much more predominantly. It was even more extreme rise as we got into about 2006. But my point of my graph is you see this has really come back down. It's come back down pretty close, maybe not all the way, but pretty close to where it was before. So we think that the recession, as painful as has been, is we've really worked through this. And we're in better shape. What about consumer saving? Well, consumer saving, we know we've been borrowing more in the 2000s, and let me show you just how much more. This is a graph that shows how much consumers have had to pay to service their debt. So it's something called household financial obligations, which is a monthly number, which is the amount you pay for the things that, well, you'll get carted off to jail if you don't pay. I mean, things like housing payments, car payments, credit card payments, etc. All right? You make these payments, and how much money do you have to pay them? Well, that's your after-tax income. So if I take the ratio of these, it gives you an idea of how much stress serving financial obligations is having on consumers. And you can see starting about 1994, this went up from about 16%, almost all the way up to 19%, in the U.S. economy as a whole, which was a considerable increase in what economists like to call leveraging or borrowing by consumers. But look what happened in the recession. It's really come down. It's come down very, very rapidly. Of course, I'd like to say that this came down because we all reached into our mattresses, pulled out a big pile of cash, and paid off our debt. But of course, what's really happened typically is that we've seen bankruptcies, we've seen foreclosures, and we've seen banks writing off bad debt, which of course is a very stressful thing to happen to the economy. But once it's done, then consumers are in a little bit better shape, because not only are consumers shedding debt, but they're actually setting aside more of their income to savings. Now, this is a slightly different concept. Income and savings are both flows. So every month you get a paycheck. How much do you spend? Okay? Let's not make this personal. Let's talk about the whole economy. If you look at the whole economy, if you go back to 2005, it was almost 99% of income was spent. So only 1% was being held aside, held back for savings. No one knows exactly where this so-called housing savings rate should be, but that was very, very low. Look what happened when the housing price bubble broke and the recession hit. That savings rates went up almost beyond 7% in some quarters, and now we're forecasting them to hover somewhere between 4 and 5%. So that's a big change for consumers. By the way, this has big implications for where we're coming out of the recovery as well. I mean, in the Missoula economy, if we used to spend 99% of our money and now we're spending 95 or 94% of our money, that's less money being spent in the economy. That's going to put a little squeeze on the folks who are supported by consumer spending. Let's go to a different area. Let's go to world trade. Because here's something that's really been a persistent problem, and that is that year after year after year, countries are running deficits. In fact, the U.S. deficit, this is the U.S. deficit, trade deficit, which is defined as the difference between imports and exports. Okay? It's a negative number because net dollars are flowing out of the U.S. because we're buying more than we're exporting and getting back in revenues abroad. If you go back to 96, and you can go even further back than this, you can see the pattern. It's grown, it's shrunk, but it's persistently negative. But you know, on a global accounting basis, our deficit has to be someone else's surplus. I mean, it has to equal. And in fact, there are groups of countries that are on the other side of the ledger. This is one group. This is the oil-producing countries. So this is the OPECs, this is the Nigerias, the Venezuelas, and so forth, who are exporting their oil to the rest of the industrialized world by and large, and they've persistently been running surpluses. Other groups of countries, Germany and Japan, export-oriented economies, large economies, have been running surpluses over this whole period. On the other side of the ledger is a group of countries which are largely, I call them other current account deficit countries, mostly in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, including Turkey, running deficits just like the U.S. has been. China, there's China and the Pacific Rim countries, very significant surpluses. And finally, the last one is the rest of the world. The point of this graph is, well, you can see, I mean, on a pure accounting basis, sure, I mean, deficits and surplus has to offset. That's just definitional. The point is the height of these bars. Of course, they're mirror images. And these bars are growing larger and larger and larger until the recession hit in 2009. You can see the second bar from the last, oh, that really shrank back. The recession really had a lot of good impacts on trade imbalances, but it's not the way we wanted to do it, okay? The way we'd like to do this is through a coordinated policy that would stop countries from manipulating their currency and keeping deficits permanent when market forces would tend to shrink them. And you can see in 2010, those bars are starting to grow again. And in fact, the International Monetary Fund forecasts these things are going to start growing just like the rest of the economy. So really, on a global trade basis, we're still in Herbert Stein's world of something's going on that can't go on forever. Well, let me talk about government, because I want to talk about something upbeat. No, that's just kidding. Government finances are a mess, all right? But you know what? We're in a recession. They're always a mess. But there's something different now, and that is because the recession has hit government like a tidal wave. And as the wave is receding and we're into recovery, there's some things that have been revealed, shall we say. Some problems have come into much clearer context that need to be worked with. Let's start with state and local governments. Here's the path of state tax revenue, and not Montana. This is all states. And there's two recessions on here. You can't miss them. Okay, in the middle of the graph is the 2001 recession, and there you can see just what kind of hit occurred in state tax revenues in the current recession. States, it's gotten worse and worse for states in terms of the sensitivity of their taxes to the economy. And states, as you know, are dependent on things like income and sales tax. And by the way, Montana does have a sales tax, just not a general sales tax. And the sensitivity of the state's revenue to those revenue instruments has actually increased over time. Local has been a little bit better shape. Locals, by and large, on the property tax is going to be impacted by home prices, but it just hasn't been impacted yet. And like a tidal wave, this tsunami, if you will, that's hit state finances and local government finances to some extent has revealed some new problems. And these problems are really, they're things to be worried about, but they're also opportunities. They're things that need to be fixed, and now is the time to fix them, I would argue. So what are those challenges? Well, the first is just the recession, as I mentioned. A really bad recession, really big deficits. If you total all the states in the current fiscal year, about $140 billion, thank goodness Montana is not in that list. All right, fiscal year 12 already projected $102 billion. This is all the states. So this is clearly a challenge for the states, filling that hole, but it's not a new challenge, it's just a bigger challenge that has been seen before. Some new challenges are, well, in this particular recession, the federal government really did a lot of borrowing on behalf of states. And that's called stimulus, and that was very effective from a short-term economic management point of view, but every stimulus has a hangover, and boy, there's a big one right now. Because as the stimulus is removed, that's an extra whammy, because all these deficit numbers I have in the previous bullet point include the federal money being included in there. Well, we also have a unique problem now because local governments are going to really start feeling the pinch of property values coming down. Property values are going to be reflected, believe it or not. Is there a back door here? Can I talk about assessments? I don't see a back door. Oh, there's one. You know, property tax assessments, values are going to start showing up in assessments, and this is really going to be a little bit of a squeeze for local governments. And then there's two problems that have always been there, but they're just getting worse. The Medicaid obligations. The provost was up here talking about the difficulty of pushing the university's cause forward in the legislative session this year. Well, there's a lot of folks who are there pushing their causes, and one is Medicaid, K-12, lots of different programs. But Medicaid obligations are growing very rapidly. It's really kind of a, I can say this in Missoula because we're an educated community. Can I use this term? Cognitive dissonance. It's people are in a state of disbelief about Medicaid. The legislatures everywhere in Montana and elsewhere are talking about cutting Medicaid. And yet here we have the Health Care Reform Act that envisions 16 million more people being covered by health insurance, the vast majority of which are on Medicaid. So Medicaid obligations are in fact growing. And this is an issue. And of course, pensions. Pensions have always been there, but we're much closer to the precipice in pensions. In fact, the pension problem in state government and local governments is a lot worse than people think because of the accounting rules and because of what's happened to the economy. Pew Center for the States estimated that the total pension fund shortfall, okay? So of course in a state pension fund, which is typically, as you know, a defined benefit pension, where you're guaranteed a certain proportion of your income or whatever the formula is in your retirement, in order to meet the obligations that are currently on the books, all right, which have been incurred for the current retirees and those who are expected to retire in the future, you take the amount of money that's needed and the amount of money you have. And the difference between those two numbers at the end of 2008 was $1 trillion. Now, I've been told I'm supposed to spell out $1 trillion because no one appreciates how big that number is. So that's 1, comma, zeros, that's a big number, all right? But it's actually worse than that because since the study was completed, pension funds across the country, public pension funds have declined by an average of 25%. And in fact, the accounting rules for public pensions are different than what private pension funds have to follow. And they're much more generous and they're much more opaque. And in fact, the American Enterprise Institute study estimated, bringing the whole problem forward all the way to 2010, that if public funds had to follow the same accounting rules as private sector funds, it would be a $3 trillion deficit. So that's a problem that needs to be fixed. It's good that we're fixing it. because it needs to be fixed and it's a good opportunity to do it, but it's a big problem. On the federal side, it's kind of funny, this slide has the word optimistic and federal debt in the same title. How is that possible? If you look at what's happened historically to the federal debt, and clearly this is the bottom line. The federal debt, of course, is the accumulation of deficits. All right, so it's a big number. It's a scary number, and economists don't like big, scary numbers, so we tend to divide them by the biggest number we know to kind of knock it down to size, and that's gross domestic product, which right now is about 14 trillion, seems like a big number. But you can see even when dividing by GDP that this is starting to grow currently. The big peak, by the way, was World War II. Deficits were only $200 billion. It seems funny to say only $200 billion, but as a proportion of the economy, they were very, very large. They were paid down, as you can see, and now we get to a period where those deficits are starting to go up. But the scary thing is a projection, and this projection just changed. This is what I would call a very optimistic projection of federal debt divided by GDP going all the way out to 2035. And it's a big and growing number, but the point is it's really unrealistic projection because it forecasts, for example, that certain things which have never happened will happen, all right? For example, it forecasts that we will cut Medicare reimbursements to doctors savagely, very large cuts. Why? Because those are in current law. Congress has never done that. They keep pushing it off. They keep temporarily suspending those payment reductions. It forecasts that the alternative minimum tax, which is the second entire tax universe, which applies supposedly only to the most wealthy taxpayers, but in fact affects an increasing proportion of Americans over time because the brackets aren't indexed for inflation, all right? So as we go forward in time, we have kind of this automatic tax increase that we haven't felt because Congress keeps pushing it off. They keep passing legislation to push it off. So a number of these scenarios that are probably not going to happen, even in this scenario, debt is growing. Of course, the alternate scenario, and most of you are sitting down, you got a Bloody Mary with you here. The alternate scenario is a little scarier. The alternate scenario looks at things like healthcare costs on current trajectory, taxes, these sorts of things never being. A more realistic scenario puts us on a much faster growth. Folks, neither one of these is in our history. This is not a forecast. This cannot happen. It won't happen. But it's the trajectory we're on, and clearly some things need to change if we're going to fix that. What's driving that, by and large, is entitlement spending. At least that's one of the big drivers. And to really look at this, the Congressional Budget Office has looked at what entitlement spending, well, entitlements, what do I mean? Well, Social Security, the big healthcare programs, all right? What's spending doing on those programs, and where's it projected to go? Well, you know, if we didn't have a demographic bulge happening, which together with increased longevity has given us this big increase in the proportion of our population which is older, okay? So if we didn't have this aging impact, and if we didn't have health care costs rising much, much faster than everything else in the economy, then we would have a picture of entitlement spending which was relatively stable. Of course, it's growing. Everything grows in the economy, but as a proportion of the economy, which is shown in this graph, entitlement spending would be more sustainable, but that's not the problem. I mean, the problem is we have aging, and aging impacts all the programs. It affects the healthcare programs and Social Security. You can see what a big impact that has on future growth. And finally, if you throw in excess cost growth in healthcare, then you're really on an up escalator. So when you think about the kinds of things you can change here, you can't change the commitments you've already made. You can't change the fact that we're all getting older collectively because of the processes I was talking about, but you can dive into the excess cost growth, and I think that's important. Unfortunately, Congress is not, and here I step off my usual, well, this is a bipartisan bash here. I'm sort of bashing Congress because it's not working very well. As an economist, it kind of gets me mad, so I started using this word dysfunction. Congress is really not working very well when it comes to spending money. Here we are well into a fiscal year, congressional fiscal year. We don't have a budget, and we haven't had them lately. We have all kinds of temporary tax provisions in the code. So we have lots of things expiring. You could even say the debt ceiling is a temporary provision, and we don't deal with it very smoothly. It's always a crisis. It's always a problem, shutdown, so forth. Congress is they're really opposed to cuts. If you look at what they do rather than what they say, they oppose cuts that are proposed by the agencies who would be cut. So Secretary of Defense proposes cuts, just to take an example, and Congress doesn't pass them. We don't pass appropriation bills on time. We put controversial policies in must-pass legislation. It's really a tough road to hoe in Congress these days. It just seems like it's getting worse. And I don't know how to fix that problem, but it's clearly part of the problem because, of course, we do have the usual stalemate between the two parties in terms of how to cut the budget. Well, how do we get on the right course? All right. What are we doing here? Because I really see this as an opportunity to fix the problem, and I know that we all want to see the problem fixed as well. And how would we get started? Well, with respect to what's happening in housing and consumer debt, really, repairs are underway. I mean, it's really the market doing it, and I don't want to sound too much like a libertarian here, but the market does work pretty well here, and it's doing a pretty good job. It's not a pretty picture. Foreclosure is not a good thing to look at. But it's something that, if you can't afford a house, that is the end result, and we're well underway. International trade, well, this is a big area. But what it comes down to here in terms of these persistent trade deficits is that whether or not we're going to go to war, so to speak, not literally, thankfully, and retaliate or cooperate. And it sounds like cooperation is the better strategy, and I would argue very strongly that it is. But cooperation in an international realm involves doing one thing that Americans don't like to do, and that is subject themselves to international bodies, all right? Because cooperation requires rules, and rules require enforcement. And boy, we as Americans don't like it when international courts tell us you can't do that. But that's what cooperation is going to entail. It's a tough road, and something needs to move there. In terms of what's going on with the government, there's lots of good things that could be done right away. One thing, and I don't have time to go into it, is really the Medicaid needs to be redesigned. I mean, the way Medicaid is funded, when states save money on Medicaid, they lose federal money. Well, there's a great incentive to save money. All right, we can fix that problem. There's some smart people who thought about ways of fixing it. In terms of pensions, boy, that one is easy and unpopular. All right. We can't do anything collectively about pension obligations we've already incurred, and they're big, and those underfunding amounts are big. But why are we making them worse? We need to change course right now and change over our pension structure in the state of Montana, as well as every place else, to something that's sustainable, because this one is really come unraveled. And I think it's a good opportunity, and it needs to be done. There's just a couple of states that have done it. On the U.S. side, gosh, I mean, you see how much space I have? Do you think I can fix the federal debt in this little space here? But we ought to recognize that healthcare costs are the big driver of what's really blowing the problem up today, and we need to address that very, very comprehensively and really embrace cost reduction in healthcare as being the #1 goal. Even if we don't agree how to do it, we should at least agree on that. Entitlement reform, I mean, gosh, that's so easy to say sitting up here on a podium. But just think about this. If the problem with entitlements is that we're spending too much money, guess what entitlement reform is? Less. Less money. So that's what it's about. It's a way of doing that fairly and sensibly and in a way that we can sustain, but that's what it's all about. So with that, I will stop and say that I think the glass is half full, and let's get to work on these problems. Thank you very much.
We do have a few minutes for questions, and again, if you have a question, please go to the mic stands.
Oh, nobody wants to do that.
I guess you were perfect, Pat. You answered everybody's questions. Anybody at all? Well, Pat, let me ask one. We saw the graphs about trade deficits. So we know that we need to shrink our portion of that under part of the graph, where we're in a trade imbalance and we're importing more than exporting. How about those net exporters? Are they also worried about the size of those bars?
That's a good question. There are some problems caused by persistent surpluses. And the problem is that when you run a surplus, and it tends to have an impact on your currency. So if you're an export-oriented country, you're completing globally trying to sell your goods, Germany and Japan and so forth. When they run surpluses, it tends to make their currencies appreciate, which makes the prices of their goods higher. So when they're trying to compete globally, and the value of what used to be the Deutschmark, now the euro, and the yen keeps going up, that's a problem. It's a problem of a different order of magnitude than what's happening for us, though, I think.
We do have a question over here. There may be a switch on there that needs just to move, and we've got somebody coming to help.
You had a slide on house prices. You had a slide on house prices. And if I read it correctly, it looked like it suggested that prices were still 20% too high. Is that a correct reading of that slide?
That's housing prices,
Housing
just
prices,
in case
yeah,
you didn't
sorry.
catch the beginning of that.
Yeah, that's actually not the measure people use to really try to measure balance in housing markets. The one that's actually used is a little bit more complex, which compares home values to rents. Because there's good reasons why housing prices could go up relative to income. I mean, land is scarce, population shifts and so forth. You're exactly right, though. They came down to not quite all the way.
Right.
20% too close. I'm not sure that the housing price to income needs to come all the way back down. I just tried to give order of magnitude thing,
Right,
but that's
That's a good point relative to rents, too. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, looks like we have a gentleman here.
yeah.
You made a quick comment just as you were talking there about sales tax in Montana, and you says Montana does have a sales tax. I guess I'd just like you to expand on that comment.
Oh, we have selective taxes. We tax tires, we tax alcohol, we tax room and board, we tax rental cars. I mean, there's things you can buy that have a tax. We just don't have a general sales tax. So we don't have and even in states that have a, quote, general sales tax, there's always exemptions. So that was a comment. And even though that's a much smaller piece of the pie, it's still economically sensitive. That's all I meant by that.
Question over on this side.
Good morning. I guess I tend to be more of a problem solver in my job. So I'm going to ask you as an economist. When you go and you start talking about the reforms that are necessary in the pension world, can you be a little bit more descriptive of the things you would like to see done in pension reform?
I'll try to be. It's tough to describe pension reform without getting into a lot of jargon. But in the private sector, there's basically two branches in terms of pensions, as many of you in business know. A defined benefit pension is one in which you incur pension rights as you work, and your company that you work for sets money aside as long as you work. And then when you retire, there's some kind of formula that determines your pension, and that's your pension amount. So it's so-called defined benefit. Defined contribution pension is where we need to go. It's not popular. I wouldn't want to go from one to the other either. A defined contribution pension is one where your employer says, I will set aside a certain amount of money. Here is an amount of money. I'll give it to you every month. Invest it as you see fit. That's for your pension. And of course, that has special tax treatment and so forth. All right. Then when you retire, it all depends on how that investment has performed. That's how much you can draw that investment down as you see fit. So that's more risky for you, the employee. All right. But currently, pension system is a great deal for state workers because the risk is borne by taxpayers. All right. Look at what's happening. The pensions are underfunded. all right? So who tops that up? Current taxpayers. So that's the issue. I think we need to move to a defined contribution pension scheme. I think that's imperative. I'm afraid. I realize that's my opinion, and there can be disagreements, but there can be no doubt that the current system now is in trouble.
We want to make sure we stay on schedule, so I think we'll move on to the next section. I do want to just draw your attention to the placards. We have 3 statewide sponsors that are helping make these Outlook seminars possible this year, and they are Northwestern Energy, Pacific Steel and Recycling, and Benefice Health System. So we do appreciate those sponsors and their support of this program. You're going to get a second helping of Pat, or to quote Robert De Niro, double dose. But this is actually going to be kind of a tag team next segment, because you're also going to hear from Paul Polzin. So you get the wonderful tag team of Pat Barkey and Paul Polzin taking on the state economy in a national and global context and the local economy. Pat, you're back up.
Thanks, Ian. Turning to look at the economic outlook, I start to use different muscles on my face because I start to smile more, because we are moving towards stronger growth. And I find that that comment meets with some skepticism amongst Montanans. So let me explain to you why we think stronger growth is right in our immediate future here in Montana and also in Missoula. For one thing, in the short term, you can't ignore the fact that emerging economies are taking off. There's very, very strong growth abroad, not in all areas, but especially in Asia and Latin America, big growth. And that helps us not only because we export to those markets, but it helps support prices that are important for Montanans. Companies in the U.S. are making money. And by the way, that's not uncorrelated with that first point. A lot of times they're making the money abroad. But companies are making money and they're starting to spend it. And that is not bad for the economy, and that suggests we're about to move to a faster gear because companies are thinking expansion and not cost cutting. There has been an important new stimulus to the economy from federal government in the last tax bill that was passed in December, which, as you know, most of the publicity had to do with extending Bush tax cuts, controversial, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, but hidden in there was a temporary reduction in the payroll tax paid by employees, which is something that you pay on the first dollar you make. And so that is a very important new stimulus, as well as depreciation rules, which have been extended, all of which suggests that 2011 is the year when companies are going to push their investments forward, and it's really going to help growth. And as I said before in the earlier presentation, consumer debt is in better shape. They're better positioned to spend, consumers. Long term, we're not quite as optimistic. We're worried about the stimulus hangover. When that's removed, that's a drag. There are tax increases ahead. In the next couple of years, the Bush tax cuts come up again. We think they're probably not going to be renewed. At least that's the assumption of our forecast. There's also tax increases in the health care bill that are coming aboard. States are going to continue to be a drag. Solvency in Montana, I don't say those two in the same sentence, but I might say it for Illinois. There's some very significant issues among states, and that's going to be a drag on the economy nationally when you take them collectively. And of course, we're worried whether or not we've been through a financial panic and we've passed a reform bill. Did we get it right? History suggests we should be pretty humble about this because it takes many, many times to finally get it right. It took many, many times in the Depression before we finally realized that deposit insurance is what the banking system needed. It took about 90 years before we figured that out. As you look around the globe, things are different today than they were a year ago. A year ago, all governments were in the same shape, their economies were in deep recession, and they were all with their foot on the gas pedal trying to stimulate economic activity. Today, things are different. In the U.S., we're out of the recession, but we're growing slowly. So people are still concerned, and we're still trying to stimulate the economy. We're still have very low interest rates. We still have the Federal Reserve buying U.S. treasuries and so forth. But if you go over to Europe, things are quite different right now because they're on the brink of a second financial crisis. They're looking at sovereign debt default. Greece is going to default. I think everyone has to know that. And the question is, how bad is it going to be and when's it going to happen?
But you have countries like Ireland and Portugal, and we're worried about Spain and to some extent Italy. I mean, they're right on this. And if you look at the measures of financial stress, they're running very high in Europe right now. So what they're doing is immediately trying to correct their government deficits. Big, savage cuts in the UK, Portugal, and some of the other countries I mentioned. In the emerging economies around the world, completely different problem. Their economies have taken off. They're running very hot. In fact, they have inflation, and their currencies are appreciating, and they're trying to put the brakes on their economy. They're raising interest rates. The policy rate of the Central Bank of Brazil today is 11.75%. All right, in the U.S. it's 0.2. So a big, big difference. If you look around the world, this is the contrast you see. And if you look at what's happening, in this case, let's look at manufacturing output. And you look around the world and you group these countries. And the first group is the so-called advanced countries. So U.S., Canada, Japan, Western Europe. If you look at what's happened in manufacturing going all the way back to the beginning of the last decade, it's grown a little, but not much, and you can clearly see the recession. But look at the trajectory as you go around. If you look at Latin America, same pattern with the recession. It was global, but faster growth trajectory. You go to Central and Eastern Europe. Look at what's happened. I mean, they're growing significantly faster, at least on trend. And finally, look at what's happened in Asia. Asia is incredible. This is non-Japan Asia. Sure, there was a recession in Singapore. I think it lasted a couple weeks. But today, manufacturing output in Asia is 25% higher than it was in the pre-recession peak. And most of these other parts of the world haven't even hit where they were when the recession started. That's really reflected in commodity prices. We track this very closely in our office. Paul Polson has put this graph up many, many times. But if you look at the trajectory of some of these prices that are important in Montana, as a natural resource-driven state to some extent. Here's the trajectory of oil prices ending in the spring of '09 when, of course, they plunged significantly. We all know that from the retail price of gasoline. There's copper, there's lead, there's zinc. Roughly the same profile, not exactly coincident, but in 2009 they all plunged. Last year I noted the remarkable recovery all these prices had made, and you can see now a year further ahead, well, there's been a few speed bumps, but by and large, that recovery has continued. Those prices are something that are really putting some stress on people around the economy, but they're good news for Montana. And speaking of good news, there's another commodity that we track very closely, not quite as dramatic, and that's what's happened with wheat. And you can see there right at the very end of the graph that wheat prices have come up significantly. George Haynes will talk about that. So, you know, the big driver for our economy is the U.S. What do we expect to see happen? Well, it's really going to be an export-driven growth in 2011. The dollar's depreciating, faster growth, that's good news for exports. We got this new stimulus that's going to help push investment, boost consumption in 2011. Inflation so far is a non-problem. Core inflation running about between 1% and 2%. So we haven't seen any signs of inflation. We're not expecting it in the short term. About a 3% growth rate by post-recession standards, that's really slow. But that's fast enough to start to chip away at unemployment. Projections are unemployment rate nationally comes down, but only to 9% or so. The thing about this forecast now is that the risks are more balanced. We're always worried about what could go wrong in our forecasts. And of course, there are many things that could go wrong with this forecast to make it too optimistic. So we could have new problems in financial markets, international incidents, contagion of the Greek default in Europe spreading around the world. Lots of things could happen to make this nice story being told right here go wrong. But it's important to note that there are also things that could happen that make this too pessimistic. And in fact, consumers and businesses are really pretty well positioned to spend, and they could surprise us and spend more, and we could come in low. So we see that as a situation where the risks today are a little more balanced in our forecast. And of course, our optimism does fade a little bit beyond 2013 because of some of these problems. What about Montana? Well, the big picture for Montana is told by this is my favorite picture, is the one that tells the profile of what's happened to jobs in the recession. It's the one economic indicator we can all relate to. And of course, we know there's been a big decline in employment. This is the U.S. economy, starting at the end of '07, coming right up now to December 10. There's the Montana economy. That's the big story with this recession, is that it was very coincident with the U.S. economy. It was very similar in magnitude, and really not much happening in job growth over the last year, 2010. But you know, jobs are one of the last things to come around in a recovery. And in fact, there is evidence of growth in the Montana economy. And let me show you a slightly different indicator. We track Montana state income tax withholding figures, which are recorded every month in Helena. We track those very closely because they tell us something about the tax base, because they're automatic. A lot of taxes are accounting, they're moving things forward and backward in time in order to make tax advantages. Withholding is automatic. And so as withholding goes, so goes wage and salaries, at least those subject to tax. What's been happening? Well, if you take a 12-month period that ends in November 2009, now I've learned to say, and I'm sure you're all learning, 2009, that was the year before last. That wasn't last year before last, okay? November 2009, of course, that was a bad year. And these negative bars indicate that withholding payments started coming in lower than they did the year before. And when they finished the year in November 2009, they were down about 2%. And that's an indicator, of course, of decline. What's happened in 2010 has been started out the same. We started out with some of these bars being negative, but as we got into the early summer, those withholding payments started coming in higher than they were the previous year. Now, that's not enough to bail out state government, but it is an indicator that the Montana economy has been growing. In fact, they were up by about 3.5%. So that's pretty good news. But really, to get the full picture of what's going on with the economy, we need to look at the most comprehensive data we can get. Unfortunately, that data is never up to date. It only goes through the first half of 2010. If you look at wage and salary disbursements in the entire economy, that's where it stops. So that's a dollar amount, wage and salary disbursements. If I look at the growth in that dollar amount, it tells me how the economy is doing. I can take the last 18 months and divide them into three periods, 3 6-month periods, 2 halves of 2009 and 2010. If I look at the total picture, what you see is the real depths of the recession in 2009, especially in the first half, really not much happening, kind of a sideways year in the first half of the Montana economy in 2010. But even with that almost zero growth, now wage and salary disbursements, which are money received in wages and salaries by Montanans, are right up to, and in fact a little bit above, where they were when the recession began, about 101% of what they were in the fourth quarter of '07. So sideways year for the whole economy, at least as much as we have data for. Sadly, not so much for some sectors. Construction continued to contract significantly, another 13% decline in the first half of 2010, and sadly, construction wage and salary is down almost 3/4 of where it was when the recession began. Manufacturing, and this is where Smurfit really shows up, in the first half of 2010 had another 5.5% decline. This is statewide. There's been some good things happening in manufacturing, but overall it's only 84% of where it was prior to the recession. Just a couple other sectors, because I could go on with these as I have, but I got a timekeeper here watching me. Healthcare is an area that has been doing better. You can see the growth in 2009, but even healthcare stumbled in the first half of 2010, and cutbacks in healthcare are not unheard of, but stands about 115% of where it was before the recession began. Public administration, which is all government, it's not government, public schools, and a few other things, but you can see that thanks to the stimulus and thanks to census, it's continued to grow and now stands at 120% of where it was before the recession began. So let's talk about the forecast. We always think about the Montana economy as being composed of two pieces. The first piece is the driver, and the second piece are the passengers. And the drivers of the economy are not the whole economy. As a matter of fact, they're not even half of the economy. But they're the part of the economy that seems to matter in terms of where the overall economy goes. We call these basic industries. And we have a list of these statewide. They're mining, wood and paper products, agriculture, travel, other manufacturing, which is the manufacturing minus wood products, transportation, and the federal government. You may not be on this list. You're important, and you may be very important in Missoula, but we find as forecasters that if we can forecast what these sectors are doing, that's where the overall economy goes. In fact, we always put in the briefing book a figure which tracks the path of these two pieces of the economy I mentioned, and you'll see that they track very, very closely. So in order to do the forecast, we need to assess what these sectors are doing. So let's go through this list, and other speakers will give more detail. In terms of mining, very strong growth potential. On an upward trajectory, strong export markets, things are looking really good in the natural resources side of the economy. Wood and paper products, sadly, remain depressed. In fact, with the closure of Smurfit, we're going to have to start taking the word paper off of here, sadly, because it's really, the prospects there are really no further damage, but no growth prospects, at least in the short term. Agriculture, as George Haynes will mention, and you probably saw from that wheat price going up, prospects are good. Things can change, but right now we're looking like we're going to see some very, very good years in ag in Montana. Travel, as Norman Nickerson will say, is recovering as the economy recovers. So it's taken a big hit, but consumer spending is coming back nationally, and we expect to see more spending by tourists here in Montana. Other manufacturing, take out wood products, and we see strong growth potential for manufacturing. The kinds of things we make here in Montana, as well as the very, very strong export markets, make things rosy there. Transportation is a sector that, again, is coming back as the economy comes back. The big hit that happened in the first half of 2009 in world trade really hurt transportation. Of course, we've had our problems with respect to Montana Rail and what's going on with Smurfit, but there aren't quite as many empty rail cars parked on railroads these days as there were back in this time last year. The federal government is a big player in the Montana economy. It's a big player here in Missoula. On the military side, we don't really know what's going to happen. Risks remain, is what we say, because we don't know. We know that there's always a threat of consolidation and closure and change in our military facilities. That threat seems to be independent of the economy, but now that the economy and the pressure on federal spending is so strong, it seems like those are significant threats. We don't know what's going to happen. We expect federal government to be cutting back. You can see that from our detailed forecast in the booklet. That's something that has risen, and now we expect it to be slowly falling. So our overall forecast looks something like this. What are we forecasting? We're forecasting non-farm labor income. That's the money received by Montanans in wage and salary and also proprietor income. We look at the growth of that, corrected for inflation, and you see 08 and 09 in our scorecard were not happy years. But you know what? They're a little bit further back. What happened in 2010, 0.9% growth, that's about exactly what we forecast. So the economy wasn't good, but our forecast was. Yeah, we're kind of weird that way. We actually show our forecast performance, by the way, in the briefing book. What are we forecasting? Well, we're forecasting really about the same thing we forecast last year. It's just that now we've moved along the time axis and we're closer now to coming into the faster growth period. So between 2 and 3% growth the next couple of years. We get a little worried past then because we're worried what's going to happen to taxes, and we think growth is going to take a bit of a hit. But we're looking at growth that on average in the Montana economy was about 3.3% before the recession began, and we expect to see growth about 2.1% on average the next 4 years for the overall state economy. That's usually where I stop. I know I've been talking a long time. There's a lot of people praying I'll stop. But I actually have a little more sidebar because I want to introduce something that we're going to be putting in future programs, because I've talked a little bit about energy. And, you know, we put up this list of what makes the Montana economy tick, and there's no energy on this list. Where's energy? And the problem with it is that the energy is not in the way government classifies industries. And so we've gotten a little lazy and we followed the government, but you know, it is in there. Coal mining, oil production is in mining. Petroleum refineries are manufacturing, as manufacturing wind turbines. Transportation, pipelines are in there. And oh yeah, there's also something called other. There's lots of service industries that support energy industries. And I just want to take a little tour very quickly of where the heck these things are in Montana, because the next program, next year, we're going to feature energy as one of our featured industries, which is something probably should have been done a long time ago, but it's tough to get everything in. Coal mining is in the 4 counties in southeast Montana, about 1,000 employees, and there's, as I said, the prospects are relatively good for all the extraction industries in Montana. You can see where they are primarily. If you look at petroleum refining, obviously it's in the 2 counties, primarily in Yellowstone County, but 1 refinery in Cascade County. Again, almost 1,100 jobs, 5 companies. You've got oil drilling and gas well drilling almost entirely in these days, at least in the 2009 data in Richland County. A little bit of gas activity on the High Line, about 300 employees. There's a significant amount of support activity for all of this. There's the geologists, there's the engineers, and these folks tend to be in Yellowstone County. Billings is the headquarters for the energy industry in Montana, and that's where they are, but they're also in eastern Montana and where the exploration takes place. But pretty significant employment. Boy, you know, we actually have an electric generating station in Colstrip. It's got over 500 employees, and that's, you know, that's something that drives the economy as well, because they're exporting electricity to the Northwest states in addition to serving Montana. And you look at these energy sectors, and we noticed when we finally did the work to find them and pull them out, a lot of them are doing quite well. You look at what's happened with coal mining, this ends in '09, petroleum refining up, drilling in oil and gas wells, of course, has gone down as Bakken activity has declined and shifted over to North Dakota. That may come back, but the point is we need to pay more attention to it. Support activities for oil and gas did take a hit in the recession, but you can see the strong upward trajectory they've had. Pipeline transportation is something which has been steady but growing. So you look at these, and it's really a big piece of the economy. And of course, this is just the traditional energy industry, if you will. On the wind side, it's a lot more difficult to quantify because a lot of it is still ahead. But if you look at the profile of a typical wind farm project, a lot of it is very highly leveraged towards construction because these facilities are new. So the development that's planned to hook up to the MATL line up by Sunburst, you know, 300-ish workers for 2 years there, and 22 workers in terms of operation going forward just for that one farm. So this is a big piece of the economy we need to start paying some more attention to. We plan to do that in the future, and I think hopefully it'll add and make the program very valuable. So with that, I will stop and turn it over to Paul Polzin. Paul, of course, is super well known here in Missoula, whether you're a handball player or you go to forecast presentations, and Paul will share his comments about what's happening here in Missoula County. Thank you.
Almost no part of Montana missed this recession. But the course of the recession was very different as we go from one part of the state to the other part of the state. So what I'd like to do today is concentrate on Missoula, see how the recession played out here in Missoula, and compare Missoula to the other major cities in the state. Let's start a little bit about history. Where were we before this recession began? The last recession ended in 2001. From 2001 to 2007, we were in the recovery phase of the last business cycle. So here we have performance in Montana and the major urban areas in the state from 2001 to 2007. Overall, the statewide economy increased about 3.3% over that period. That's a relatively high period, a relatively high growth rate. The 50-year average for Montana is about a 2% real growth rate. That's because we had those very fast growth years of 2005 and 2006. You can see the performance of the various cities in Montana ranked in order there. Where was the fast-growing parts of the state? They were in Flathead County and Gallatin County, well above the statewide average. I think the surprise for many people is that where is the slow-growing part of the state? We know that Missoula is suffering from the business cycle, from this recession. But this slow growth in Missoula was occurring before this recession began. You can see that we were growing at about 2.4% per year from 2001 to 2007, and also our neighbor to the south, Ravalli County, was growing at about 2.7% per year. So this slow growth in Missoula is not a new phenomenon. Now, why was Missoula growing slower than the other cities? Three very big reasons. One, much of the energy development was occurring in eastern Montana. Second, we had some permanent closures, especially in the wood products industry. And third, and the one that I'm perhaps most worried about, is that Missoula continues to lose share as a regional trade center. And we'll come back and talk about that in just a minute. But when we look at our cities across Montana, We had the fast-growing areas in Flathead and Gallatin County. We had 3 areas that were growing at about the statewide average: Silverbow County, Yellowstone County, and Lewis and Clark County. And the 3 slower growing areas were Missoula, Cascade, and Ravalli. Okay, that's history. What happened during the recession? Here we have the change in labor income during 2008 and 2009. Those were the recession years. Overall, the statewide average, the state declined at about 1.3% per year over these 2 years. You can see that the areas that were growing fastest, especially Gallatin County and Flathead County, were those that then were hurt most by this recession. Flathead County was declining at about 6% per year, and Gallatin County was declining at about 3.7%. The surprise, again, is Ravalli County, and we'll come back and talk about Ravalli in just a minute, but the decline in Ravalli County was right in there with Flathead and Gallatin County. Missoula County declined at about 1.2% per year over this period, about the statewide average. But in just a minute, when we look more carefully at Missoula, we'll see that the recession here in Missoula lasted longer than in the other cities. So even though it looks as though we had a relatively moderate recession impact, it was over a much longer, it was over a year longer than the other areas. What were the areas that were least impacted by this recession? Cascade County and Lewis and Clark County, counties that are dominated by government, Malmstrom Air Force Base in Great Falls, and state government in Lewis and Clark County. Let's look at the profile of the recession. How did this recession evolve over time? Here we're looking at monthly employment. You can see that here in Missoula, monthly employment remained relatively stable early in a recession, in early 2008. The big declines in employment were during late 2008 and early 2009. And you can see the downward dip there in early 2010, which reflects the shutdown of Smurfit Stone. Now, the important thing to see with this figure is that those 2 years and 3 years of decline have put the Missoula economy into a deep hole. Later on, we're going to talk about growth here in Missoula County. But it's going to take a couple of years of growth here in Missoula County just to get back to where we were. So that's the important thing to see, that we are in a deep hole when it comes to the economy, and it's going to take several years of growth just to get back to where we were. Here we have Ravalli County. And again, we can see that the declines in employment in Ravalli County were more severe than in Missoula County, but most of them were concentrated in late 2008 and early 2009. One of the sectors that was very hard hit by this recession was construction and also real estate. Look briefly at what happened to construction activity here in Missoula County. You can see that there were very strong declines strong decline in 2008 and a 17% decline in 2009. And in 2010, that 1.4% increase, it could just about be stable. So there were 2 years of significant, very significant declines in construction activity. What do the figures look like in Ravalli County? Well, you can see why Ravalli County was declining faster than Missoula County. Construction declined very, very significantly, a 30% decline in 2009 alone, and again, almost no growth in 2010. Now, what makes the Missoula economy tick? Here we have the basic industries for Missoula County. The largest single sector of the Missoula economy now is state government. That includes both the University of Montana, and it also includes the other state government agencies here in Missoula. The trade center industries represent those people who come to Missoula to shop, see a doctor or dentist, or do other things. This is the part of the economy we're kind of worried about, because we see Kalispell and Hamilton chipping away at our role as a regional trade center. The federal government is here representing the Forest Service plus the other agencies. Wood and paper products. As you can see, this is an average for 2008 and 2010. If we would only be looking at 2010, of course, it would be just wood, and there would be no paper component. Transportation is both trucking and railroads, non-resident travel, and other. What are we looking for in terms of each of these basic industries? Oh, and then there's also construction, which is not a basic industry, but is a very important component of economic growth right now. We're looking for relatively slow growth, relatively slow recovery in terms of construction. We were under a pay freeze in state government. There is a modest pay increase currently before the legislature, so we're looking for just a very modest growth in terms of the state government component. Trade center, again, this reflects our concern that Hamilton and Kalispell are chipping away at our role as a trade center, and we've been losing share here. It's difficult to determine, or forecast, what's going to happen to healthcare, the export component, the basic component of healthcare in Missoula until we know a little bit more about the effects of reform. Probably, though, it will continue to grow as a basic industry. The federal government, as Pat said, maybe statewide, we're looking at small declines. So here in Missoula, if it remains stable, we're very happy. Wood and paper products. Well, hopefully we have the bad news behind us, and the wood products industry remains stable. Transportation, again, starts to recover as the U.S. economy recovers. Non-resident travel, again, starts to recover as the U.S. economy recovers. So how does this now play out in terms of our forecast for growth? The first thing to notice, history. If you look at any of the other counties in your briefing book, you'll see that at most, and the other counties experienced 2 years of decline associated with this recession. Missoula is the only one to have 3 straight years of decline. So again, this plays into that hole that was created in the economy that's going to take us a while to recover. So we were forecasting between 1 and 2% growth, right about 2% growth from 2011 to 2014. How does that compare to history? Well, during the period 2001 to 2007, we were growing a little more than 2% per year. From 2010 to 2014, we grow just maybe 0.5% more, or 0.5% less. So our forecast growth is roughly equal to what we were experiencing before the recession. Now, how does this compare? How do all the cities compare? We're looking for about 3.3% growth as we go forward in terms of the future. The fast-growing areas in the state are going to be Yellowstone and Gallatin County. Later on, if you want, I can tell you why this is occurring. The slowest growing part of the state is going to be probably Lewis and Clark County. Why is that? Well, nobody's very optimistic about the economic future, the impact of state government. We're looking for growth here in Missoula County to be about 2% per year, slightly less than the statewide average, and Ravalli County to be about right at the statewide average, 2.3%. So with that, I'd like to close, and Pat and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Again, if you would move to the microphones, we'll make sure that those are on and ready for you. Paul, let me ask you a question. You mentioned that some of the retail trade center role that Missoula is playing is now shifting a bit to Kalispell and Hamilton. Is there any other community in Montana that's experiencing the same thing?
Yes, exactly the same thing is happening in Billings, where Miles City and Bozeman are chipping away at Billings' role as a retail center. So this phenomenon is not unique to Missoula, and a lot of it has to do, some people call it the Walmart effect, where a new super Walmart goes into Miles City, but much more than that. When people stay, it also reflects services being available locally. The accounting firms in Miles City or perhaps Flathead County become more sophisticated so that businesses in Kalispell don't have to deal with an accounting firm in Missoula. And that's just an example of the other kinds of things that are happening.
So they're actually able to support their local business and be loyal to their locals at our expense.
I don't know if I want to phrase it in terms of loyalty, but the role of a trade center is certainly a dynamic relationship. And if you kind of look back, even 20 or 30 years ago, who were the dominant cities in Montana? Billings and Great Falls. And Great Falls just simply does not play that role now. So the spatial dimension of the trade center effect is very, very dynamic and changes and results from policy actions.
Well, let me, excuse me, let me ask about kind of the pie chart, if you will, of Missoula's economy. No one wanted, excuse me, no one wanted Smurfit Stone to close. But now that it's gone, we seem to have a more diversified portfolio in our economy. No one sector is as big as, say, Malmstrom Air Base in Great Falls or state government in Helena. Is there any benefit we can see to that?
It's a real trade-off. We've got a smaller economic base. We've got a smaller economy. Part of the reasons why we had 3 years of decline is we had permanent closures in the wood products industry. Yes, it's more diverse, but boy, we're paying a pretty significant price for that.
And we will have a presentation, a local presentation on Missoula's economy a bit later. Yes, sir, a question?
My question relates to unemployment. I don't know if we'll get a chance to talk about it a little bit later today. I'm just curious, I read a lot of blogs, economic blogs, and there's a lot of concern nationally about unemployment not recovering, it being structurally depressed and remaining at 10% nationwide. I'm wondering what the unemployment forecast might look like for Montana in your opinion.
I think the path of unemployment in Montana, unemployment rates will be fairly similar to what's happening in the U.S., but the whole level is lower. Unemployment rates, the monthly changes in unemployment rates, which get a lot of PR, really have to do with what's happening with the labor force. At the first inkling that the labor market is improving, people come into the labor market. There's other things happening as well. So I'm not paying too much attention to the monthly fluctuations. But we're what, 7.2, something like that, and the U.S. is in the 9.2, 9.3, somewhere in that area. Forecasts for my forecast for Montana, we actually don't forecast an unemployment rate for a lot of reasons, but I would expect maybe a half-point decline, which is right on line with what's happening with the U.S.
Inside your question, are you really asking, should we expect these kinds of percentages to continue for a long term? Is that what you mean when you get,
yeah,
say,
on the
we're
national
structurally
level, a lot of authors are saying that this is, and economists are saying that this is something that won't recover in the U.S. economy, that we're looking at a new structure in how labor is treated nationwide. So I'm wondering if that is true for Montana as well, that will persist at 7% in the long term, or if there's any reason to expect that Montana is different, in terms of our economic makeup.
Yeah, that's a great question. My feeling is no, 7% is not the new normal for Montana unemployment rate, and neither do I think that 9% is the new normal for the U.S. Persistence of a so-called structural change in employment has to do with the fact that, construction would be a classic example. If we don't come back to where we were before in construction, it seems like we got an awful lot of people who are skilled at construction that don't have good prospects. I just point that out as an example of the phenomenon. But the economy has adjusted to these kind of changes. It just, every recession has seen a longer and longer time period before the labor market comes back into adjustment and we start fully employing our folks. So it's a great debate. I wish we could talk more about that exact issue here.
Well, thank you.
But the bottom line is slow recovery in unemployment rates, but we do see a recovery, not simply a stagnation where we are now.
Question?
You mentioned that Ravalli and Kalispell have been taking share from Missoula's retail. Do you have any sense of what internet shopping, online shopping has done, and is there any potential upside to that? Is there a way to capitalize on that?
We don't really have any local statistics. It does appear that internet shopping is growing very rapidly, but it's still a relatively small share of the total. Again, it's not just retail that is being shifted to the secondary or trade centers. It's financial services, it's healthcare. I mean, if you go out to Miles City, Billings Clinic just opened a branch office in Miles City, and that is a sizable component of the loss from Billings to Custer County, to Miles City. So is internet retail going to grow? Yes, but it's still a very, very small part. How do we benefit from it? I would hope that we have our own internet retailers. Vans is a very prime example. They apparently have a national prominence. I see them reviewed in Consumer Reports. So that would be the way we're benefiting from that.
Yes, sir.
You made brief comments about the energy sector and the Bakken oil fields and the fact that the oil exploration has gone into North Dakota. Is that because of geology or taxation issues for Montana? I know that my research shows that there's like 150 oil rigs presently drilling in North Dakota and about 10 or 12 in Montana.
Well, there's two ways I can answer that question. The one is the way I should answer it and the way I want to. I should answer it as a researcher. So I should present you with the findings of research to try to answer that very question. Don't have an answer. All right. The way I want to answer it is just to give you my opinion, which is what always happens when you get up with a microphone. I think there's reasons above and beyond taxation why drilling rigs tend to cluster. All right. I mean, there's real reasons why drilling rigs should be lumpy in different parts of the Bakken field because of labor force, because of informational advantages, you know, when you're all drilling close to each other. My feeling is, and I've seen some other projections of this, is that lumpiness could swing over onto Montana's side of the border for that reason. Taxation, that's a different issue, but I think there's more to it than that.
Any other questions? If not, let's take a coffee break. We'll come back in about 10, maybe 15 minutes. So take a break, enjoy. Thank you for being here.